The first sound I remember is laughter, the wrong kind of laughter. Not the warm, honeyed kind that fills a wedding hall, but the sharp, metallic sound people make when they don't know what else to do. It sliced through the room a second after my father announced into the microphone, "This boy is an idiot, but my daughter insisted on marrying him anyway." People laughed. They actually laughed. And in that frozen second, while my husband's face drained of color and my own hands began to tremble, I realized something terrifying. The man who had shaped my childhood was about to shape the rest of my life unless I stopped him. My legs felt weak, but something inside me, something I didn't know still existed, rose like a wave. I pushed my chair back. The scraping sound cut the laughter clean in half. Everyone turned to look at me, but I only saw one face, my father's. Smug. Certain of his power. Certain I would stay silent like I always had. He had no idea what I was about to do. He had no idea this time I wouldn't let him be the loudest voice in the room. People say your wedding day should be a beginning, not an ending. But for me, it was both. It was the beginning of my marriage and the end of my fear. The hall we'd rented in the middle of Beaufort, South Carolina wasn't glamorous, but it was warm and familiar. Strings of soft lights hung from the beams, catching reflections in the glasses of sweet tea and champagne. The scent of roasted chicken and cornbread drifted from the buffet line. My mother had chosen cream-colored linens because she said white was too cold for Southern hearts, and the DJ, a retired Coast Guard officer, played gentle Motown as people drifted to their seats. Everything looked like the start of a peaceful life, until the moment my father stood up and claimed the spotlight. But before I tell you what happened after I pushed my chair back, before I show you the path that led me to the microphone, I need to take you back to the hours before the wedding. Because nothing that happened in that room made sense unless you understood the years leading up to it and the storm that gathered the night before. I woke up early on my wedding day, long before the sun rose. The house where my family was staying for the weekend, an old marshfront rental with creaky floors, and the faint scent of pine felt too quiet for how many relatives were inside it. My mother was already awake brewing coffee, her shoulders tense. My sister Hannah sat at the table cutting strawberries, the knife tapping against the bowl. Neither of them asked how I had slept, and I didn't ask them either, because we all knew the answer. I kept replaying my father's words from the night before. "You still have time to cancel this wedding." He had said it like a warning, like he was doing me a favor. He stood in the narrow hallway beside the rows of childhood photographs, me in my Coast Guard uniform, Hannah at her high school graduation, my parents on their 25th anniversary, and looked at me as if I were an enemy he was trying to outmaneuver. "Love won't fix, stupid," he'd muttered. "And that man you're marrying is soft, weak. He'll drag you down." It wasn't new. My father had always spoken like that, but the cruelty of the message and the timing 24 hours before I said I do hit me in a place I didn't know was still vulnerable. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face, the certainty in his jaw, the dismissiveness in his tone. A lifetime of his opinions trying to overwrite my own. But when the sunlight finally broke through the blinds and danced across the hardwood floor, I made myself breathe. Deeply. Slowly. I told myself this was my day. Mine and Evan's. Not my father's. Evan texted me just as I poured a cup of coffee. "Good morning, beautiful. Whatever happens today, we'll face it together." He wasn't a man of grand speeches. He didn't need to be. His steadiness was the kind I had learned to lean on without even realizing it. And right then that text felt like a rope pulling me back to solid ground. My mother tried to smile as I sat down beside her. "Big day," she whispered, but her eyes didn't match her tone. They were red-rimmed, tired. "Has he said anything this morning?" I asked. She shook her head. "Your father went for a drive. He said he needed space to think." That could mean anything. My father's thinking had a way of becoming everyone else's problem. Relatives began shuffling through the kitchen, my aunt from Tennessee, cousins from Atlanta, my grandmother's sister who had flown from Kentucky and wasn't pleased to see the tension in the house. People hugged me, told me I looked radiant, asked if I was nervous. I kept smiling, but beneath it was a tightness in my chest, a pressure like someone holding a palm against my sternum. I dressed silently in the little guest room upstairs. My dress wasn't extravagant, just a simple ivory gown with lace at the sleeves, but when I slipped it on, I felt a softness settle around me. A reminder that I was allowed to feel joy no matter what my father believed about strength or weakness. Hannah came in without knocking, carrying a pair of earrings. "These were Grandma's," she said softly. "She'd want you to wear them." I saw something fragile in her expression, worry mixed with pride. "I'm sorry he talked to you like that last night," she added, eyes fixed on the earrings. "It's not your fault," I whispered. "No," she said. "But it shouldn't have been yours either." She hugged me then, and I held her so tightly my fingers trembled. My sister, the one who used to hide behind me during thunderstorms, was now offering me comfort I didn't know I needed. The ceremony itself was beautiful. We exchanged vows under an arch my mother had decorated with magnolia branches. Evan's hand was warm in mine, his voice steady, as he promised to love me with patience and honesty. When I looked at him, I didn't see doubt. I saw a man who had chosen me without hesitation, without fear. My father didn't meet my gaze during the ceremony. He kept his eyes fixed somewhere past us, jaw-tight, arms crossed. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, he clapped once sharp solitary, and then stopped as if he'd fulfilled an obligation but refused to feel anything about it. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself he couldn't ruin this. I told myself his silence was easier than his fury. I told myself a lot of things that would turn out to be wrong. The reception hall glowed with soft light as people filed in. The DJ played our first dance song, guests took their seats, and plates of steaming food were carried out. Evan and I greeted table after table, smiling until our cheeks hurt. For a brief stretch of time, I let myself relax. My father stayed near the back of the room, speaking quietly to two of his brothers, glancing my way only once. Then the DJ walked toward the stage, tapping the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin the toasts." But before he could finish, my father stood. The movement itself felt violent, like something ripping through a calm surface. "I'd like to say something," he announced. He didn't wait for permission. He stepped onto the small platform, reached for the microphone, and gave the DJ a firm nod that meant move. The DJ stepped aside. I froze. I knew that posture, that tone, that look in his eyes. Evan squeezed my hand under the table, but I barely felt it. My father tapped the microphone twice. "Testing," he said, and the sound echoed through the hall. Guests quieted. Chairs shifted. Silverware stopped clinking. He looked directly at Evan, then smirked. "This boy," he said slowly, "is an idiot. But my daughter insisted on marrying him anyway." The words didn't feel real at first. They felt like something pulled from a nightmare, one of those dreams where your voice gets stuck in your throat and you can't move, no matter how hard you try. Then the laughter came. Not loud, not joyful, awkward, nervous. People laughed because they thought they were supposed to, or because they didn't know him, or because they didn't know me. But I knew. And when I turned to Evan, I saw the color drain from his face so fast it felt like watching someone lose air underwater. His eyes dropped to the table, his hand tightened around the napkin. A tremor moved down his jaw. My father laughed at his own line, soaking in the attention. Something broke in me. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, cleanly. Like a thread that had been pulled too tight for too long. I felt my chest rise, my pulse hammering against my ribs, my breath come in sharp, controlled bursts. Years of Coast Guard training told me to stay composed. Years of being his daughter told me to stay silent. But something older than fear woke up inside me. I pushed my chair back. The sound cut through the room like a blade. Conversations died instantly. Heads turned. My father looked amused, as if he believed he had won whatever twisted game he thought he was playing. I stood. My legs trembled, but they held. And without saying a word, I began walking toward the microphone. Every step tightened the air in the room. Every step peeled back a layer of the girl he raised. I didn't look at Evan. I didn't look at my mother. I didn't look at the guests who now stared at me with wide, uncertain eyes. I looked at only one person. The man who taught me to fear silence more than shouting. The man who believed volume made him right. The man who thought humiliation was a form of leadership. My father. When I reached the stage, the DJ extended his hand to claim the microphone back from my father, but I stepped between them. "I'll take it," I said. My father blinked. A crack of uncertainty flickered across his face. For the first time in my life, he didn't know what I was going to do next, and in that moment, standing under the warm lights of a hall filled with people who had witnessed both my joy and my humiliation, I understood something I had never understood before. Fear doesn't disappear. You just stop letting it choose your actions. I lifted the microphone, turned toward the room, and felt a stillness settle around me, deep and ancient, like standing in the eye of a storm. "My father," I said softly, "has embarrassed me my whole life. But tonight, he crossed a line. You could have heard a pin drop. And that's where everything truly began." When I said those first words into the microphone, the room froze. But the truth is, the fear that pushed those words out of me didn't begin at that wedding. It didn't begin with Evan. It didn't begin with any moment you could point to on a calendar. It began years earlier in a little house shaded by live oaks at the edge of Savannah, where my father's voice filled every corner long before I learned how to speak back. I grew up in a neighborhood where kids rode their bikes without helmets, and neighbors shouted hello across driveways. Mama hung laundry on the clothesline behind the house, and Hannah and I chased lightning bugs in the early evenings. It looked peaceful from the outside. Most people thought it was. People love the illusion of a simple Southern family where the father works hard, the mother cooks, and the children behave. They see what they want to see. Inside our house, though, there was another truth. A truth that lived in the tone of my father's footsteps, in the way Mama flinched when a cabinet door slammed. In the silence I learned to sit in so I wouldn't draw attention to myself. Fear wasn't a single moment. It was a climate. My father had a rule for everything. Shoes lined up perfectly by the door, no loud voices at dinner, no talking back, and absolutely no crying. Tears were weakness. Emotion was drama. Mistakes were punishable. He didn't just want a quiet house. He wanted a controlled house where he was the axis everyone else orbited around. Some of my earliest memories are of listening for the creak of the hallway floorboards. When I heard them, I'd straighten my posture lower, my voice make myself smaller. When Hannah and I fought over toys like normal sisters, he didn't separate us gently. He'd bark, "Stop that nonsense before I give you something real to cry about." That sentence still echoes in me sometimes. Mama would smooth things over later, telling us he just had a hard day or didn't mean it like that. She believed softness could soothe any wound. But softness without boundaries is just silence wearing a dress, and silence doesn't save children. It only teaches them how to survive. I was 10 the first time I realized my father's pride mattered more to him than my feelings. It was Thanksgiving, and Mama had spent the whole morning basting the turkey and arranging the table. She asked me to fold the napkins into little fans, and I worked so hard to get each crease perfect. When Daddy walked in, I looked up at him, waiting for his approval like it was air I needed to breathe. He scanned the table, frowned, and said, "You folded these wrong." Then he swept his hand across the table and sent the napkins fluttering to the floor. Mama flinched. I froze. Hannah stared. Daddy didn't pick them up. He didn't help. He just sat down in his chair and waited for us to correct the mistake. I remember kneeling on the tile floor, refolding each napkin while my face burned. He talked to Mama about football as if nothing had happened, as if knocking the breath out of a child didn't matter. That was the first moment I felt humiliation settle like dust in my lungs. But Daddy didn't see it as cruelty. He saw it as teaching. He always believed he was teaching us something. When I turned 12, I started softball. I loved running bases, the way the dirt kicked up around my cleats, the way I could feel strong without anyone else's permission. Daddy showed up to my first game, leaned against the chain-link fence, and watched me with an expression I couldn't read. When I scored a run, I ran toward him for approval. All he said was, "You should have slid. You're too careful." There was always a should have. Always a standard just beyond reach. Always a way to be better, but never a way to be enough. By the time I was in high school, I knew exactly who I was allowed to be around him. Small, agreeable, useful, never too emotional, never too bold. Anytime I expressed an opinion he didn't like, he'd say, "Don't get smart with me," as if my thoughts were weapons aimed at him. Hannah learned to disappear, blending into the background in a way I envied. She had a gentler spirit, and he rarely singled her out. But Mama and we carried more of the impact. Mama because she loved him. Me because I challenged him simply by wanting something different. When I told him I wanted to join the Coast Guard, he laughed. A deep, mocking laugh that echoed in my memory long after the moment passed. "You won't last a month," he said. "You're too emotional. They'll eat you alive." He didn't know that hearing him doubt me felt like fuel. His disbelief burned, but it pushed me forward. When I left home for training, Mama cried, Hannah hugged me tight, and Daddy said, "You'll be back." But I didn't come back. Not right away. Not in the way he expected. And the longer I was gone, the more I saw what life looked like without his voice shaping every thought I had. Coast Guard training was hard, but it was fair. Expectations were high, but they were clear. When I made mistakes, instructors corrected me without humiliating me. When I succeeded, they acknowledged it without tearing it down. It was the first place I learned that authority didn't have to roar to be respected, that strength could be calm, that leadership could be earned. I felt something inside me rebuilding slowly, painfully, but surely. Yet every time I returned home on leave, Daddy treated my service like a hobby. He'd introduce me to people by saying, "This is my daughter who ran off to play soldier," as if my deployment was nothing more than a passing phase. Sometimes his comments made me angry. Sometimes they made me laugh. But mostly, they made me tired. Exhaustion is a special kind of grief. One afternoon during a rare quiet moment with Mama, she told me he had been bragging to neighbors that he taught me everything I knew about discipline. The irony almost choked me. Mama saw the disbelief on my face and said softly, "He doesn't understand how to give credit. He only understands how to take it." Hannah, who had grown bolder with age, told me that Daddy talked to her the way he used to talk to me. Not as harshly, but with the same impatience. The same need to correct, the same inability to listen. "It's like he thinks he knows us better than we know ourselves," she said. I realized then that none of us had ever been truly seen by him. We were reflections of what he believed a family should look like, not who we actually were. He expected obedience, not connection. I remember visiting home during a stormy December. Rain hammered the windows and the fireplace crackled weakly. I sat at the kitchen table writing a letter to a friend from the service when Daddy walked in, saw the pen in my hand and said, "Shouldn't you be doing something useful?" The question wasn't genuine. It was a jab meant to remind me that my time only mattered when it served him. Mama turned from the stove and said, "She's just writing a letter." "That's what I mean," he said, always in her feelings. I didn't look up. I didn't defend myself. I'd learned there's no winning a debate with a man who only listens to the sound of his own voice. But that night, lying in my childhood bedroom with the rain tapping softly at the window, I realized something. His voice had followed me across states, across deployments, across years. Even when I was proud of myself, a part of me still waited for his criticism. A part of me still wanted his approval even when I knew it would never come. You don't outgrow your childhood. You outgrow the silence you were forced to keep. I didn't understand that fully until much later, until the day Evan came into my life, but the seeds were already there. As I got older, my relationship with Daddy became a quiet tug-of-war. He wanted control. I wanted distance. Mama tried to be the bridge between us, but bridges only hold if both sides have something to anchor to. Daddy had his anger. I had my absence. There wasn't much connecting us beyond genetics and years of swallowed pride. Still, I wanted a father, A real one. Not the man he became when he was disappointed or threatened. I wanted to believe he could soften, that he could change that. Somewhere behind the sharp edges was someone who cared enough to try. He didn't, at least not then. On the morning of my wedding, as I stood before the mirror looking at my reflection dressed in ivory lace, I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who flinched at slammed doors, who folded napkins perfectly to avoid criticism, who tried to make herself small enough to slip under the radar of her father's moods. I touched the earrings Hannah had given me and wondered if Daddy ever truly wanted to know me at all. Not the version he talked about proudly to strangers, but the real me, the woman I had become despite him, not because of him. I thought about confronting him that morning. I thought about telling him he couldn't speak to me the way he did the night before. But the truth is, I was tired. Tired of fighting a battle that never ended. Tired of hoping for change that never came. Tired of wanting love from someone who only offered control. So I stayed quiet. Not out of fear, but out of necessity. I didn't want my wedding day to be another memory shaped by his voice. But silence is a fragile shield. And when he picked up that microphone at the reception, when he let the word idiot fall from his lips and land like a blow against the man I loved, something ancient inside me snapped. Not the part of me that feared him, the part of me that remembered everything leading to that moment. Every napkin knocked to the floor, every comment that cut deeper than a belt ever could. Every time I swallowed my voice to keep the peace, every time he mistook obedience for love. By the time I stood up from that table, I wasn't just defending Evan. I was defending the little girl I used to be. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to be louder than the voice that had controlled me for 3 decades. I didn't truly understand what respect felt like until the afternoon I met Evan Brooks. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There were no fireworks, no sweeping music, no sudden realization that my life was about to shift. It was simple and quiet, almost forgettable, except it wasn't. Because sometimes life doesn't change with an explosion. Sometimes it changes with a soft hello. It happened on a breezy Saturday in early spring when I was home on leave. A storm had torn through the marshes the week before, leaving several families without homes, and the community center had organized a relief drive. I'd volunteered partly out of duty, partly out of habit, and partly because being at home under my father's shadow made my skin feel too tight. The gymnasium inside the community center looked like every multi-purpose room in the South, scuffed basketball lines, metal folding chairs stacked against the wall, fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Tables were lined with jackets, diapers, canned goods, blankets, and toiletries. The air smelled like coffee plastic bags, and a faint hint of tomato soup warming in a crock pot. I was carrying a box of donated socks when I saw him. He was stacking cans on a long table in front of him, carefully lining up the labels so they faced forward. Not obsessively, just intentionally, as if even small acts deserved attention. His hair was wind-tousled, his t-shirt faded, and his jeans had that worn look that comes from actual work, not fashion. He didn't notice me at first. He was humming softly an old country tune I recognized from the radio Mama used to play. He wasn't handsome in the loud, obvious way some men try to be. He didn't posture. He didn't check to see if anyone was watching. There was something gentle in the slope of his shoulders, something steady in the way his hands moved. I noticed all of it in the span of 3 seconds, and it lodged itself somewhere deeper than I expected. I set the box down beside him and said, "You building a tower there?" He startled, blinking up at me. Then he smiled a real smile, unguarded, warm. Trying to keep them from collapsing, he said, "Geometry wasn't my strongest subject." I laughed before I even realized I was going to. "Lieutenant in the Coast Guard," I told him. "I've seen worse structures." "Oh," he said, his eyebrows lifting. "So you're the muscle around here." "The brains, too," I replied. His grin widened. Not flirtatious, not bold, just amused. Safe. He held out a hand. "Evan." "Marion," I said, shaking it. We worked side by side for the next hour, sliding boxes into neat rows, packing bags for families who walked through the doors with exhaustion clinging to their faces. Evan spoke softly to everyone, especially the older folks. When a little boy began to cry because the jacket he wanted was too big, Evan knelt beside him, rolled up the sleeves and said, "There. Now it's magic." The boy stopped crying. Something inside me softened. When we took a break, Evan poured 2 cups of coffee into paper cups. "You take sugar?" he asked. "No," I said. He handed me one anyway. "It's just coffee, nothing complicated." It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. Men like my father always made simple things feel sharp and dangerous. As a child, asking for a glass of water could become a lecture. In the Coast Guard, things were fair but rigid. But Evan handed me coffee like it was an offering, not an obligation. We sat on the bleachers watching volunteers file in and out. A draft blew through the cracked door carrying the scent of fresh rain. "What got you into the Coast Guard?" Evan asked. "Escape," I said truthfully before I could stop myself. He didn't look surprised. He didn't ask what I meant. He simply nodded as if he understood there were stories behind my answer that weren't meant for a first conversation. "And you?" I asked. "I build things," he said. "Roads, mostly. Bridges, sometimes. Infrastructure for the county. Important work." He shrugged with a half-smile. "Important enough to keep me employed. You talk about it like you don't want credit." "I don't need credit," he said. "I just like making things that last." I don't know why, but that sentence slipped under my defenses. Maybe because it was the opposite of my father's philosophy. He controlled things, broke things, rebuilt nothing. As the day went on, Evan and I kept ending up near each other, sorting through stacks of blankets or checking inventory. Every time I looked up, he was there, steady as a heartbeat. When he talked, he met my eyes without trying to dominate the space between us. When he listened, he didn't interrupt. I didn't realize how rare that was until it was in front of me. Later in the afternoon, an older volunteer leaned over and whispered, "He's been here since dawn. Kind soul, that one. Helps everyone but never says much about himself." I pretended not to care about the comment, but it stayed with me like a warm ember in the chest. When the drive finally ended, people filtered out one by one. Evan walked with me to my car. The sun was setting, casting gold across the marsh grass. He kicked lightly at a pebble on the pavement. "It was good working with you," he said. "You too." There was a pause, not uncomfortable but thoughtful. "Would you maybe want to get coffee sometime?" he asked. "The kind that comes in a real mug, not one of those paper ones." A part of me bristled with old fear. My father's voice echoed through my head. "Don't trust kindness. Don't trust softness. Don't trust anyone who shows emotion." But another part, a quieter, braver part, leaned forward. "I'd like that," I said. Evan grinned again, the same warm, easy expression he'd worn all day. "Great. Here, let me give you my number. Unless you want me to take yours." "I can take yours," I said quickly. "I'm better at reaching out than waiting." He laughed. "Fair enough." I saved his number and slid into my car. As I drove away, I realized I was smiling at nothing. A small, surprised smile. The kind that feels like discovering a new room in a house you've lived in all your life. I didn't tell my father about Evan right away. I knew how it would go. Daddy didn't trust men he couldn't measure with outdated standards. He respected loud voices, firm handshakes, and jobs that required sweat and steel. Evan was quiet, thoughtful. A civil engineer who built bridges instead of breaking them. Someone like my father didn't understand someone like Evan. But over the next few weeks, we kept meeting for coffee or walking the trail behind the marsh. Evan asked questions gently, always leaving space for me to answer or stay silent. He never pushed. He remembered everything I said, the names of people in my unit, the way I liked to sit facing the door, the story of how Mama used to tuck my hair behind my ear when I had nightmares. "What about your family?" I asked him once as we sat near the water. He smiled in that sad, fond way that people do when love and loss are entwined. "My folks didn't have much money," he said. "But they had each other. And they raised me to believe kindness isn't something you give to people who earn it. It's something you give because you can." I felt something tighten in my chest. I hadn't grown up with that definition of kindness. My father believed kindness made a person weak. I told Evan as much, and he winced a little. That must have been hard, he said. Not judgmental, not pitying, just honest. I didn't know how much I needed someone to say those words until he said them. The first time Evan came to a family cookout, the air felt thick with tension before we even stepped inside. Mama greeted him warmly, Hannah smiled shyly, but Daddy looked him up and down like a building inspector looking for faults. "So, this is the man," he said. Evan extended a hand. Daddy shook it too hard. It wasn't a handshake, it was a test. Evan didn't take the bait. He simply nodded and said, "Thank you for having me." Daddy snorted. "We'll see if you still say that after dinner." That was how it began. During the meal, Daddy asked Evan about his job. Evan answered politely, explaining a project he'd been working on for the county. Daddy leaned back and smirked. "So you draw pictures while real men build things." Evan's expression softened, not hardened. "Well, sir, I design things that keep families safe. That's important to me." For a moment, just a moment, Daddy had no response. His face twitched, his posture stiffened, and I realized something unsettling. My father didn't know what to do with a man who couldn't be intimidated. After the cookout, Evan walked me to my car. He waited until we were alone before speaking. "He's direct," he said carefully. "That's a generous word," I replied. Evan hesitated. "Marion, I don't mind proving myself, but I don't want to fight him. I'm not here to take something from him." I stared at him, struck by his honesty. "He sees you as a threat," I whispered. "He always saw kindness as weakness." Evan shook his head. "Kindness isn't weakness. It's strength people don't know how to measure." His words hit me harder than I wanted them to. For the first time, I realized my father's world and Evan's world were built from different materials. One was forged from control volume and intimidation. The other from steadiness, patience, and respect. I had spent my whole life believing only one could win. But standing beside Evan that night, watching him look at me with quiet certainty, I wondered if maybe I had been wrong. Maybe softness could stand up to steel. Maybe kindness could outlast cruelty. Maybe someone like Evan could love someone like me. And maybe someone like my father sensed all of it long before I did. The ride home from that cookout was one of the quietest drives of my life. Evan kept his hand steady on the wheel eyes fixed on the road that cut through the marshland, but I could feel the tension vibrating under his calm like a low electrical hum. The windows were cracked just enough for the night air to drift in, carrying the scent of pluff mud and salt. Neither of us spoke for nearly 10 minutes. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't awkwardness. It was the kind of silence that sits in the back seat and listens. Evan was the one who broke it first. "Your father doesn't dislike me," he said quietly. "He wants me gone." I turned my face toward the window, watching the faint reflection of my own expression. "I know," I whispered. "He's not subtle," Evan added, though his tone wasn't harsh. If anything, it held compassion for the child I once was. "I don't think he sees me as a threat the way other men might. I think he sees me as a reminder. A reminder of that you're not under his roof anymore." I pressed my lips together and didn't answer, because even though he didn't know my father well, he had already understood too much. When we reached my mother's house, I kissed Evan goodnight in the driveway. He tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, a gesture so tender it made my throat tighten. "Call me if anything happens," he said. "Nothing will I lied," even though the air felt thick and wrong. The moment I stepped inside, I knew he'd been waiting for me. My father stood in the living room, arms folded, posture rigid. The television was off. The lights were dimmed, turning the room into a stage he'd prepared for confrontation. Hannah was nowhere in sight. Mama stayed in the kitchen, pretending to look busy, but even from where I stood, I could see her shoulders tense. "Where have you been?" he asked, as if he hadn't seen me leave with Evan. "At the cookout," I replied, keeping my voice even. He jerked his chin toward the hallway. "I need a word." The hallway felt narrower than I remembered. Childhood photos stared down at me from the walls, each one a reminder of the girl I had been forced to shrink. Daddy stopped beneath the picture of me in my Coast Guard uniform, the one he always criticized quietly, because it proved I had succeeded without him. "You still have time," he said, "to cancel this whole thing." I blinked, stunned by how quickly he cut to the bone. "Dad, the wedding is next week. All the more reason to stop it now," he said. "I'm trying to save you from yourself." I let out a breath that trembled despite my effort to steady it. Save me from what? From a lifetime of picking up after a man who isn't good enough for you. He wasn't raising his voice yet, but the warning signs were all there. The way he leaned forward slightly, the way his jaw clicked, the way he used the word man like it was a title Evan hadn't earned. "Evan is kind," I said. "He's steady. He respects me." My father scoffed. "Soft men hide behind the word respect because they don't know how to lead. He doesn't want to lead me," I said, sharper than I intended. "He wants to love me." Daddy's expression twisted. "Love won't fix stupid." The words hit harder because I'd heard a version of them my whole life. Too emotional, too dramatic, too naive. Now he was aiming those same arrows at Evan. "Dad, you don't know him," I said. "Oh, I know enough," he snapped. "I know he's not strong. I know he's not someone who can protect you. I know he's going to embarrass you." A chill ran through me. The word embarrass. The one he would throw at my husband on our wedding day. I didn't know then what was coming, but my body did. Trauma remembers the future before the mind does. "I'm marrying him," I said firmly. My father leaned in close enough that I smelled the mint gum he always chewed before a lecture. "If you walk down that aisle, don't expect me to clap. Don't expect me to smile. Don't expect me to pretend." He turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the hallway with memories pressing against my ribs like invisible fingers. That night, I barely slept. I stared at the faded wallpaper of my childhood room, at the little blue stars I'd chosen when I was 10, and felt the weight of the years between then and now pressing down on me. How many moments had I lost because I was too busy navigating his moods? How many decisions had I made to avoid his disappointment rather than pursue my own joy? Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Soft ones. Mama's. I slipped downstairs and found her at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She looked up as I approached, her expression tired in a way I hadn't fully noticed before. "You're awake," she whispered. "I couldn't sleep." She nodded, staring into her tea as if it held answers. "He talked to you, didn't he?" "Yes." Mama closed her eyes briefly. I tried to stop him. "Why does he hate Evan so much?" I asked. Her face softened into something fragile. "Your father doesn't hate Evan. He hates anything he can't control." My breath caught. Has he always been like this? She swallowed, and for the first time I saw 30 years of silence reflected in her eyes. He listens to no one. Not even himself. He's always been a man who believes he's right, even when he's hurting the people he loves most. Why didn't you leave? The question slipped out before I realized it. Mama looked down at her hands. "Because I thought staying quiet would protect you girls. I thought if I absorbed the worst of him, you wouldn't have to." It felt like something inside me loosened and tightened at the same time, a mix of sorrow, understanding, and anger, not at her, but at the legacy we'd all inherited. "Mom," I whispered, "I'm scared." She reached across the table and took my hand. "Don't let him take your happiness. I lost too many years trying to survive his storms. You're stronger than that." Her voice cracked on the last word, and that was the moment I realized she'd been waiting for me to break a cycle she couldn't. The next morning, the air in the house was thick with unspoken tension. Daddy acted as if nothing had happened, which was always his way after a confrontation. He whistled while he sipped his coffee. He complimented Mama's biscuits. He asked Hannah about school. Not once did he look at me, but he watched me, every movement, every breath, every small sign of rebellion. In the days leading up to the rehearsal dinner, subtle shifts happened that told me the sabotage had already begun. A cousin from Atlanta called to say she heard Evan had been laid off, which wasn't true. An aunt pulled me aside at the grocery store and said she was worried I was rushing into marriage. A neighbor said Daddy had mentioned I wasn't thinking clearly these days. Rumors move fast in small towns, especially when a man like my father whispers them. At first I told myself I was imagining it. But patterns don't lie. And Daddy had been shaping narratives longer than I'd been alive. Evan noticed too. He didn't confront me about it, but one night as we walked along the marsh he said, "Your father is trying to shrink the space around us." I stopped walking. "What does that mean? He wants to isolate you," Evan said. "The less support you feel, the easier it is for him to push you back into place." I'd never heard it phrased that way. It felt like a truth I'd always known but never named. "I'm not going back," I whispered. Evan touched my arm gently. "I know. But he's used to people bending. It's hard for him to understand people who don't." The next Sunday, Daddy sent me a text. "Come alone. We need to talk." Those words made my stomach twist, not because I feared confrontation, but because every time he said "come alone," it meant he had planned something. When I arrived at the house, he was sitting on the porch, hands folded, looking like a man preparing for war. He gestured for me to sit beside him. I didn't. He didn't waste time. "Marrying that boy will ruin your life," he said. "No," I replied. "It will ruin your control." His jaw tightened. "You're emotional. You're not thinking straight. I'm thinking clearer than I ever have." "I'm trying to save you," he insisted. "No," I said again, my voice steady. "You're trying to save your pride." For the first time in my life, I watched my father struggle for words. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual certainty. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. But the strange thing was, the doubt in his voice wasn't about me. It was about him. He dismissed me then, waving me off like he had more important things to do than argue with reality. That night, as I sat on the edge of my bed staring out the window at the swaying Spanish moss, I realized something devastatingly simple. My father wasn't losing control. He was recalibrating it. And the next move he made would change everything. The day before my wedding should have been filled with nothing but small nerves and big joy. I should have been fussing over centerpieces or arguing with Hannah about how tightly to curl my hair, or laughing with Mama as she tried to tie ribbon bows on the chairs. Instead, the house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to crack. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't intuition. It was the simple lived truth that storms always gathered around my father. Relatives had begun arriving early that morning. Suitcases thumped down the hallways. Children ran between rooms. Someone burned a tray of biscuits. My aunt from Tallahassee brought the wrong dress and spent an hour complaining about the humidity. The house should have felt alive. Instead, every sound seemed brittle. Mama floated between the kitchen and dining room, offering drinks, adjusting platters, straightening tablecloths. Hannah sat on the floor in her rehearsal dress, ironing out a stubborn wrinkle with determination that belonged to a much older woman. I moved flowers from one vase to another, trying to ignore the knot twisting itself tight in the center of my chest. For a while, everything appeared normal, until the front door opened with the unmistakable weight of my father's presence. Even among a room full of people, he always entered like someone claiming territory. His boots hit the floor with purpose, loud enough for everyone to pause without realizing why. He stood there for a moment, scanning the room with that searching look he used not to observe but to appraise. "Where's the groom?" he asked, scratching his chin. I didn't answer quickly enough. Or perhaps there was no answer quick enough for him. He waved off the silence and said, "Never mind." "I need to talk to you," jerking his thumb toward the hallway. My stomach tightened. I glanced at Mama. She froze mid-step, her hands gripping a dish towel so tightly it twisted. Hannah stopped moving the iron. A few relatives exchanged nervous glances. Everyone knew the pattern. Daddy didn't pull someone aside for a blessing. He pulled them aside to assert control. I followed him into the narrow hallway lined with family pictures. Birthday parties, Disney World, Christmas mornings with forced smiles. It felt wrong walking past all those frozen memories to face the man who had shaped them more than anyone else. He stopped beneath the framed photo of me holding my Coast Guard graduation certificate. The same picture he never commented on unless it was to say the photographer had overcharged us. He crossed his arms. "You still have time," he said, without preamble. Time for what my voice sounded calmer than I felt. "To cancel this wedding." I stared at him, stunned by the certainty in his tone. "Dad, the ceremony is tomorrow." "All the more reason to think clearly," he replied. "I'm telling you this now because I'm trying to save you from yourself." Anger prickled in my veins. Save me from what? From a lifetime with a man who isn't good enough. He said it so plainly, as if this were not the same argument we'd been circling for months. As if Evan had committed some unforgivable crime simply by loving me. "He is good enough," I said. "He's good." Daddy's lips twisted. "He's weak. No, you just don't know him." "I know enough," he snapped. "I know he won't challenge you. I know he won't push you to be better. I know he won't protect you. I know he'll embarrass you." There it was again. That word. Embarrass. A word he weaponized like a blade, one he would stab into my husband's heart in front of 100 people the very next day. "You're wrong," I whispered. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so no one in the kitchen could hear. "You're emotional. You don't think straight when you're emotional. If you walk down that aisle tomorrow, don't expect me to clap. Don't expect me to smile. Don't expect me to pretend." He walked away before I could respond. He left me standing alone under the dim hallway light, feeling like that 10-year-old girl kneeling on the floor refolding napkins while he criticized the shape. I didn't cry. I couldn't. Crying felt too familiar, too much like giving him the reaction he expected. Instead, I went upstairs and sat on the edge of my childhood bed, staring at the wallpaper Mama and I had picked out when I was 9. Little blue stars faded now. Funny how things that once felt like magic could turn into reminders of the cages you grew up in. It wasn't long before Hannah slipped into the room, closing the door behind her. "He talked to you," she said softly. "Yeah." She sat beside me, folding her hands in her lap. "He's been pacing all morning. Mom tried to get him to run an errand, but he wouldn't leave. He's gearing up for something." "I know," I said. She looked at me with worry drawn across her face. "Are you okay?" "No," I said honestly. "But I'm getting married tomorrow." And that's the part he can't stop. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The house was quiet, filled with the faint hum of distant conversation and the occasional clatter of a dish being washed. I wandered downstairs in my socks, drawn to the faint glow of a lamp in the kitchen. Mama sat at the table again, just like she had on so many nights before when storms brewed. She had her tea, though it was untouched. Her eyes looked tired-lined with years of choosing peace over confrontation. "You're awake," she whispered. "Couldn't sleep." She nodded as if she'd expected that. "He talked to you again." "Yes," I said, "and I don't understand why he wants to ruin this for me." Mama exhaled long and slow, like she'd been holding something inside far too long. "Your father doesn't know how to let go," she said. "He thinks control is love. He thinks criticism is guidance. He thinks fear is protection." She paused. "He has always been this way." "But why?" My voice cracked. "Why can't he just be happy for me?" Her eyes softened. "Because if you choose a man who treats you better than he treats me, he'll have to admit he failed." The truth hit me like a tidal wave. Mama had never said anything like that out loud. For 30 years, she had softened his edges, smoothed his roughness, explained away his temper. Hearing her speak plainly felt like a part of her had finally stepped out of the shadows. "He'll never admit it," she added. "And you?" I asked. "What about you, Mom? Don't you want better too?" She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had wiped my tears, packed my lunches, held her marriage together with invisible thread. "I wanted peace," she said. "And I thought silence was the price." "But it isn't," I whispered. No, she said. It isn't. We sat there together, the weight of her confession settling into the cracks between us. For the first time, I saw her not as the quiet woman who bent herself around my father's storms, but as someone who had given up pieces of herself to protect her daughters. I don't want to live like that, I said. I know, she replied, and I'm proud of you for choosing differently. The next morning, the rehearsal should have brought joy. I should have been surrounded by laughter and excitement, but the tension followed my father like a shadow. Every room he walked into fell quiet. Every conversation paused. Relatives glanced back and forth between him and Evan like spectators waiting for a collision. Evan tried to stay polite, but Daddy's eyes tracked his every move, searching for failures. When Evan held the door open for Mama, Daddy muttered, overcompensating. When Evan complimented the decorations, Daddy said, people who talk too much are usually hiding something. At one point, Evan straightened a centerpiece that had tilted slightly on a table. Daddy smirked and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Told you he was soft." The insult cut through the air like a blade. Evan didn't respond, but his jaw tightened. Mama shot Daddy a warning look, which he ignored. Hannah's face flushed in embarrassment. I walked over to Evan, touching his arm lightly. "Are you okay?" He nodded, though the exhaustion in his eyes said otherwise. "Your dad doesn't need a reason," he said quietly. "He just needs an audience." The rehearsal ended early because no one could pretend the atmosphere was normal. People hugged me with tight, uncertain smiles. Cousins whispered apologies into my hair. A few relatives avoided me entirely, choosing instead to orbit around my father like planets, afraid to drift too far from the sun. When we got home that evening, Daddy slammed doors harder than usual. Mama stayed out of his way. Hannah retreated to her room. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the empty fireplace, fighting the urge to run from the house and never return. Evan called me later that night. His voice was calm, steady, exactly what I needed. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Your father doesn't get to decide your life." I know, I whispered, though my chest felt tight. "But he's going to try. Then we'll face him together." I closed my eyes. The fear was still there, crouched in the corners of my mind, whispering doubts I had learned long ago. But Evan's words were an anchor I didn't know I needed. The day before my wedding, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Daddy pacing down the hall. Each footstep sounded like a countdown. I didn't know what he was planning, but I knew this: whatever he did tomorrow would not be an accident. It would not be a slip of the tongue. It would be deliberate. And it would be cruel. I just didn't know yet how public his cruelty would become. The rehearsal dinner should have been the warm-up to the happiest day of my life, but instead it felt like walking into a room where the furniture had been subtly rearranged. Nothing looked wrong at first glance, yet nothing felt safe. It was held at a small restaurant on the edge of town, a place with wooden beams across the ceiling, and soft lighting that usually made people feel comfortable. Not that night. Not with the storm gathering in my father's eyes. Evan and I arrived early to greet guests, standing side by side as people walked in with bright smiles and wrapped boxes and well wishes. I clung to those moments, those tiny pockets of normalcy. Hannah fixed a strand of my hair, whispering, "You look beautiful," and Mama hugged me longer than usual, her arms gentle but trembling. Daddy arrived last, walking through the door like he owned the place. He scanned the room the way a general scans a battlefield. His eyes landed on Evan and tightened, as if Evan's very existence offended him. I watched him greet relatives, shaking hands firmly, clapping shoulders, laughing loudly, in a way that felt performative and hollow. We sat down for dinner, everyone shuffling into their seats with polite conversation. Evan sat next to me. Daddy sat directly across the table, close enough that I could feel the weight of his disapproval with every bite of food I took. I tried to ignore him. I tried to focus on the warm roll in my hand, on Hannah telling a story about college, on Mama smiling through her nerves. But tension has a way of sticking to the walls, amplifying every sound. The clink of forks, the scrape of a chair, the uneven breaths of a room trying too hard. When dessert arrived, Daddy leaned back in his chair, stretching like a man preparing for a performance. He tapped his spoon against the water glass, and the sound echoed through the restaurant until every conversation stopped. My stomach turned. Not again, I thought. Not tonight. I just want to say a few words, he said, his voice carrying easily. Evan stiffened beside me. Mama's hand froze on her napkin. Hannah dropped her fork. I opened my mouth to stop him, but he spoke first. Tomorrow, Daddy said my little girl's getting married. The way he emphasized little girl made my teeth clench. He paused for dramatic effect, scanning the room like a comedian timing his punchline. And I know some of you think she's making a fine choice, but I for one think she's rushing into something she doesn't understand. Several guests shifted in their seats. An aunt coughed quietly. I felt my pulse begin to pound. Now don't get me wrong, Daddy continued. Evan here seems like a decent enough fellow. He's polite, quiet, soft-spoken. But is that what a woman needs? Evan inhaled sharply. My fingers tightened around his. Daddy wasn't done. A woman needs a man who's strong. He said, his eyes locking onto Evan like a hawk sizing up a mouse. A man who can protect her, provide for her, challenge her. And I'm not convinced this one has what it takes. My vision blurred. Heat surged up my neck. The room went uncomfortably still. I could feel the collective shock of our guests, the disbelief that he would say something so cruel so publicly. But of course he would. Cruelty was his native language. I leaned forward. Dad, that's enough. But he ignored me. I'm not trying to be the bad guy, he went on, spreading his hands in a mock gesture of innocence. I'm just telling the truth. And the truth is I expected more for my daughter. The knife landed there, swift, precise, public. A few guests looked down at their plates. Mama's lips parted like she wanted to interrupt but didn't know how. Hannah quietly whispered, "Stop, Dad." But he brushed her off with a shake of his head. Evan swallowed hard, his jaw tightened. His eyes didn't lower, didn't retreat. But the hurt was unmistakable, etched into the lines around his mouth, sinking into the place where pride and pain intersect. Daddy leaned back in his chair, satisfied, as if he'd done everyone a service by announcing his disapproval. I stood so quickly my chair screeched across the floor. Gasps rippled around the room. Daddy's eyes met mine with mild amusement, which told me he believed I would back down. But something inside me snapped, not suddenly, not violently. It was quieter than that, like a thread pulled too tight for too long finally giving way. "We're done here," I said. Daddy blinked. "What, you have crossed every line you could cross?" I said, my voice steady but shaking from the inside. "And I will not let you keep doing this." Evan stood with me, placing a gentle hand on my back. Mama covered her mouth with both hands. Hannah's eyes filled not with fear, but something like relief. My father stared at me, baffled that I dared to oppose him in front of an audience. His pride cracked for the first time. "You can walk out," he said, "but it won't change the truth. I'm not interested in your version of the truth," I said. "Not anymore." I walked away from the table and headed toward the exit, Evan matching my steps, Hannah rushing behind us. Mama hesitated, torn between the man she shared a life with and the daughter she'd finally learned to stand beside. Behind me, Daddy called out, "You'll regret this, Marion." I didn't turn around. Outside, the night air felt sharp, cool against my burning skin. The parking lot lights glowed like moons suspended above us. Evan took my hand, but I pulled him into a hug instead, burying my face in his chest. His arms wrapped around me with steady, grounding warmth. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. "For what?" he asked softly. "You didn't hurt me." He did. I should have stopped him sooner. "You can't stop a man like that," he murmured. "But you stood up to him. That matters." Hannah reached us, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know you were going to do that," she said. "Marion, I've wanted you to for years." Mama stepped outside next. She looked smaller than usual, weighed down by decades of choosing quiet over confrontation. But when she reached me, she touched my arm gently. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "I'm sorry I didn't do it first." Those words nearly broke me. We drove home separately, needing space but also needing each other. Evan's truck followed behind my car like a guardian. When we arrived at Mama's house, Daddy wasn't there. The lights were on. The living room was empty. A beer bottle sat half-finished on the coffee table. The front door was left ajar. Mama sighed, looking exhausted. "He'll come back when he's ready," she said. "He always does." The three of us moved into the living room, too wired to sleep, too drained to talk much. Hannah curled up on the sofa, hugging a pillow. Mama made tea again, hands trembling slightly as she poured the water. Evan sat beside me on the floor, resting his back against the couch. I kept hearing my father's voice, that mocking tone, that confidence, that rejection disguised as concern. Every word looped in my mind like a poisonous mantra. Evan touched my knee. "Look at me." I did. "You're not wrong for loving me," he said, "and you're not wrong for demanding respect." His words steadied me like a hand on a trembling compass. "I'm scared," I admitted. "Of him?" Evan asked. "Of tomorrow," I said. "Of what he'll do, what he'll say, who he'll hurt." Evan nodded slowly. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." He meant it. I felt it in his voice, in the warmth of his hand, in the quiet conviction that had drawn me to him in the first place. I leaned into him, letting the tension melt from my shoulders. Eventually, Mama spoke. "Marion," she said softly, "your father has lived his whole life believing he knows best. When he's challenged, he lashes out. When he feels powerless, he tries to regain control. But tomorrow isn't about him, it's about you and the man you choose. And he can't destroy that unless you let him." Hannah added, her voice steadier now. I closed my eyes, listening to the women who had survived the same storms I did. I thought of every moment my father had tried to undercut my confidence, every time he made me question my own strength. And I thought of every moment Evan had built me back up. The contrast was blinding. Long after everyone went to bed, I remained awake on the sofa, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the distant chirping of crickets outside. The house was too quiet, too fragile. And as I sat there in the dim glow of the lamp, one thought kept circling my mind. If tonight was the rehearsal for Heartbreak, then tomorrow would be its main performance. But I didn't know yet how loudly he would strike, or how loudly I would answer. On the morning of my wedding, the world felt too still. The sunlight filtering through the curtains looked soft and warm, but it carried no comfort. It was the kind of light that exposes more than it soothes. I woke up before my alarm, lying there in the quiet, waiting for the weight in my chest to loosen. It didn't. It only deepened. I sat up slowly, letting my feet touch the wooden floor. The house was unusually silent. Not peaceful silent, but hollow silent, like the air had been emptied out during the night. For a moment I let myself imagine a different world, one where my father had been the kind of man who kissed his daughter's forehead and said he couldn't wait to walk her down the aisle, one where his pride came from my happiness, not his control. But reality has sharp edges, and it always returns. When I walked downstairs, Mama was already pacing the kitchen. Her hair was half pinned, half loose, as if she'd tried to get ready but could only manage the motions. She gave me a small, brave smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Morning, sweetheart," she said. "Morning." She poured me a cup of coffee, though her hands shook slightly. "You should eat something." I wasn't hungry, but I nodded. She buttered a biscuit that I only tore apart, leaving the pieces scattered across my plate. Hannah slipped into the kitchen wearing a robe, rubbing her eyes. "You okay?" she whispered. I nodded, though the answer was complicated. I was excited to marry Evan. I was terrified of what my father would do. I was exhausted from carrying fear that wasn't mine to hold anymore. And somewhere beneath everything, a quiet fire was starting to build. A fire that would not stay contained for much longer. Daddy entered the kitchen around 7. He didn't say hello. He didn't acknowledge the tension he'd caused at the rehearsal dinner. He simply opened the fridge, took out a bottle of orange juice, drank straight from it, and said, "We're leaving in an hour." Mama's jaw clenched. Hannah looked away. I sat very still. He didn't look at me when he spoke. It was as if I were furniture taking up space. A lamp, a chair, something that existed but didn't require acknowledgement. He had mastered the art of withholding affection in a way that could wound more deeply than words. The hour that followed was a blur of curling irons, makeup brushes, and whispered conversations. Mama tried to help me with my dress, but her hands fumbled. Hannah stepped in, smoothing the fabric, fastening the buttons down my spine. She paused at the last one, leaning her forehead against my shoulder. "He can't ruin this," she whispered. I wanted to believe her. The drive to the venue took 20 minutes. Daddy insisted on driving me and Mama in his truck, leaving Hannah to follow behind. I sat in the back seat, my dress draped across my lap, staring at the back of his head. He didn't speak. He didn't turn around. Mama occasionally glanced at me in the rearview mirror, offering quiet reassurance in the form of soft smiles. When we pulled up to the event center, my heart fluttered. It wasn't extravagant, but it was warm and beautiful in its own way. White lights were strung along the entrance. Volunteers bustled inside. The faint scent of gardenias drifted through the air. If you ignored the tension coiling inside my chest, it almost felt like the morning of a joyful beginning. Inside the bridal suite, the makeup artist brushed a soft color along my cheeks, while photographers snapped candid pictures. People kept saying how radiant I looked, how lucky Evan was, how today would be unforgettable. Unforgettable. Yes. They had no idea how true that would be. The ceremony itself was simple and lovely. Evan stood at the altar looking both nervous and overwhelmingly sure. When Mama walked me halfway down the aisle and stepped aside so I could walk the rest alone, tears welled in her eyes. Daddy refused to participate, claiming tradition had been watered down enough. I didn't ask him again. Evan's expression when he saw me made the whole room fade. He whispered, "You look like the rest of my life." My breath caught in my throat. This was the moment I chose him. Not because I needed saving, but because with him I never had to shrink. The vows were beautiful. My hands shook as I slipped the ring onto his finger. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, cheers erupted from the guests. Evan kissed me softly, reverently, like he understood exactly how much had been risked for this moment. And for a little while, long enough to take photos, long enough to eat half a plate of food, long enough to believe the storm might pass, it felt peaceful. It felt safe. It felt like we'd made it through. Until my father grabbed the microphone. I didn't even see him walk up to the DJ table. One moment, Evan was laughing with our friends, the next, the speakers crackled, and Daddy's voice filled the banquet hall. "Everyone listen up," he said, tapping the mic twice. "I want to say a few words about the groom." The clinking of glasses stopped. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. A cold shiver ran through the room. Mama's hand flew to her chest. Hannah whispered, "Oh, God." I felt the blood drain from my face. Daddy stood in the center of the dance floor, microphone in hand posture, loose and confident. He wasn't drunk. That would have been easier to explain. No, he was sober, purposeful, dangerous. "This boy," he said, pointing straight at Evan, "is an idiot. But my daughter insisted on marrying him anyway." Laughter, uneven, nervous, startled. People laughed because they thought he was joking, because it was easier than believing the father of the bride would intentionally humiliate the groom. But laughter is cruel when it is born from confusion. I heard it echo like a slap. Evan's face paled. His fingers tightened around his napkin. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, trying to maintain dignity that my father had already shattered. And me? My legs began to shake. Daddy shrugged theatrically. "Kids these days don't listen to their parents. So what can you do?" More laughter. He absorbed it like applause. Mama sat frozen, her face draining of color. Hannah covered her mouth. The DJ fidgeted, unsure if he should intervene. Relatives exchanged horrified glances. I felt something rise inside me, something ancient, something that had been silenced for years. It wasn't rage, not pure rage. It was clarity. A clarity that came from 30 years of being shaped, corrected, minimized, dismissed. A clarity that bloomed from the wounds he never apologized for. A clarity sharp enough to cut chains. My chair scraped the floor as I stood. The sound sliced through the room. 100 heads turned at once. Daddy's smirk faltered as I stepped forward. My hands trembled, but my spine straightened. I walked toward him, each step solid, despite the earthquake inside my chest. The DJ extended his hand, offering to take the microphone back, but I reached it first. "I'll take it," I said. Daddy blinked. Not in fear, in disbelief. Like he was seeing me for the first time but didn't recognize the woman I'd become. I turned toward the guests. The room fell silent. Completely silent. Breathless, silent. "Dad," I said, my voice calm enough to frighten him. "You've embarrassed me my whole life, but today you crossed a line. And I'm not staying silent anymore." A ripple of whispers swept through the crowd. Mama inhaled sharply. Daddy's jaw flexed. "Marion." "No," I said, shutting the door on his authority with one word. "You've had your say, for 30 years. Now I'm going to tell the truth." A woman in the back row clutched her hands together. A cousin sat forward in his chair. Evan's eyes locked onto mine, full of love and fear, and something else, hope. I drew in a breath that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. "I need everyone to hear this," I said. "Because my father isn't the man you think he is." Gasps. A few people stiffened. Hannah covered her lips. Mama began to cry silently. I looked directly at my father, and then I let 30 years of truth rise to the surface. When the words left my mouth, it felt like the entire banquet hall shifted. Not physically, but emotionally. As if everyone inside had leaned forward at the exact same moment, trying to catch their breath without making a sound. The microphone felt warm in my hand, almost alive, pulsing with all the things I had swallowed for decades. "My father isn't the man you think he is," I said again, this time louder, steadier. "And today, I'm done pretending." Daddy stiffened. His hands curled into fists at his sides. For a man who always believed he controlled every moment in a room, this one slipped out of his grasp like sand through open fingers. I looked at Evan first. His face was pale, but his eyes held something gentle and unbroken. I drew strength from that look. It anchored me. Then I faced the crowd. "You all know my father as a hard worker," I said. "A man who built half the houses in our old neighborhood. A man who has loud opinions and an even louder presence." A few people laughed nervously. Daddy glared at them, daring them to stop. "What you don't know," I continued, "is what it was like inside our home." Mama's shoulders folded inward, as if bracing for impact. Hannah reached for her hand under the table. "When I was 10, I said I folded napkins for Thanksgiving dinner. I worked on them for over an hour. When my father walked in, he took one look and knocked all of them off the table. Not because I did something wrong, but because he could." Silence fell heavier. "He called it teaching," I said. "Teaching us how to behave, teaching us how to be tough, teaching us to fear him." A ripple went through the tables. Some guests exchanged glances. Others lowered their eyes, recognizing pieces of their own childhoods in my words. He criticized every achievement I said. Every accomplishment was met with a correction. Every joy was followed by a reminder of how I could have done better. Daddy's face flushed. "That's enough," he muttered. "It's not enough," I said. "Not even close." I could feel the tremor in my breath, but I didn't let it win. I steadied myself, grounding my feet into the floor. When I enlisted in the Coast Guard, he told people I'd run away because I couldn't handle real life. When I made rank, he said promotions came easily for women. When Evan and I got engaged, he called relatives and told them not to come because my groom and his family weren't worth dressing up for. A gasp rose from the left side of the room. My aunt from Tampa covered her heart with her hand. Daddy clenched his jaw. "I was just being honest." "No," I said. "You were being cruel, and you hid behind the word honesty to make it sound noble." Mama's eyes filled with tears. She had heard all of it before, but never spoken aloud. "What you all don't know," I continued, "is that when times were hard, when money was tight, when bills stacked up and the house almost slipped into foreclosure, my father didn't lose everything because of bad luck. He lost it because he gambled. On sports, on cards, on anything promising fast money. Whispers erupted. Someone murmured, "I had no idea." Mom saved every penny she could, I said. But he drained it all. And when she confronted him, he told her she didn't understand business. Daddy took a step forward. "Put the mic down, Marion." "No," I said simply. A woman from Evan's family nodded quietly as if urging me to continue. And when I was deployed, I said my mother called me late one night and finally let the truth spill through her voice. She didn't ask for money, she never would. But I heard the fear, the worry, the exhaustion. Mama looked away, ashamed but relieved. "So I sent money home," I said, "to save the house, and my father told everyone he was the one helping me." Daddy's face darkened. He wasn't angry because the truth was being told. He was angry because the truth made him small. I took a slow breath. I'm not saying any of this to humiliate him. If humiliation was my goal, I would have walked away years ago and never looked back. Daddy shook his head. "You're making a scene." "No," I replied. "You made a scene. You humiliated my husband in front of our families. And you did it with a smile. That was your choice. Speaking the truth is mine." Evan's hand rested over his heart. Mama's shoulders eased even though her tears didn't stop. Hannah leaned forward, eyes wide but proud. I turned slightly to face Evan. "The man you all just heard my father call an idiot," I said, "is the man who drove my mother to her appointments when my father didn't have time. He's the man who volunteers on weekends at shelters. The man who repaired the parking lot outside without charging full price because he knew the center hosted charity events." Someone near the back whispered, "That's true. He did do that. And in the years I've known him, I said he has never once humiliated someone he claims to love." A long, heavy silence followed. I lowered my voice. "That's strength. Not what my father does." Daddy's breath hitched the first sign he felt something other than anger. "You think being strong means mocking your wife, your daughters, the man your child loves," I said. "You think it means talking down to people and calling it guidance. You think it means controlling everything so no one ever sees you falter." I paused. But strength isn't dominance. Strength is accountability. Something shifted in the room then, a collective exhale, a recognition. I turned to Mama. "Mom," I said softly, "I love you. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." Her hand lifted to her mouth, trembling. Daddy took a step toward me. "You're done," he said, low and dangerous. I didn't back away. I didn't lower my voice. "No, Dad," I said. "You're done." A few guests inhaled sharply. Evan stood ready to intervene if needed, but I lifted a hand slightly to signal I was okay. "Dad," I continued, "you once told me that strength meant never bending, never admitting fault, never apologizing." I shook my head. "That's not strength. That's fear." His fists clenched, but he didn't speak. Fear of losing control, fear of being seen, fear of us realizing we don't need your approval to live our lives. The room pulsed with stillness. "And here's the truth," I said. "I'm not your little girl anymore. I'm a Coast Guard officer. I'm a wife now. I'm a grown woman who will not carry the weight of your pride any longer." Daddy's posture crumbled just a fraction. Just enough for me to see that beneath his stubbornness, beneath his anger, beneath the armor he'd worn all his life, was something fragile and terrified. "If you want to be in our lives," I said, "it won't be through intimidation. It won't be through fear. It won't be through insults. It will be through respect." The word landed in the center of the room like a stone dropped into water. Respect. It rippled outward. One person clapped quietly, then another. Then a few more. It never turned into thunderous applause, but it didn't need to. It was enough. Enough to let me know I wasn't alone. Enough to let him know the room was no longer his. Daddy stood motionless, his face an unreadable shade between anger and something else, maybe shame, maybe disbelief, maybe both. I lowered the microphone. My hand shook as I set it on the DJ's table. And then I looked at Evan. His eyes shone with something I had never seen directed at me before. Something deeper than love. Something like reverence. He crossed the room, took my hand, and whispered, "You did it." I exhaled, feeling 30 years lift from my shoulders. But the story wasn't done. Because the moment I stepped away from the microphone, the entire hall held its breath, waiting, watching, listening. And it was only then that I realized the most painful silence was still coming. The moment I lowered the microphone, time didn't move normally. It stretched thin and trembling like something delicate pulled too far. No one clapped anymore. No one whispered. No one breathed too loudly. The room existed in a suspended state, held together by shock and silence. And in that silence, I could hear everything I had never said echoing back at me. My father didn't move at first. He stood frozen near the head table, his shoulders squared, his jaw working like he was trying to grind stone with his teeth. For a man who had always commanded attention, he suddenly didn't know what to do with the weight of so many eyes on him. Evan reached me first. He didn't speak. He didn't try to soothe. He simply took my hand, grounding me with a pressure that said I wasn't alone anymore. His palm was warm, steady, a place to rest after walking barefoot across broken glass. I didn't realize how hard I was shaking until he pulled me gently against his chest. My father turned away. That more than anything I had said struck me. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He didn't try to defend himself. He withdrew. He folded in on himself like a collapsing structure. For the first time in my life, I saw the man behind the volume, and he looked small. The DJ cleared his throat and awkwardly reached for his backup microphone. "Folks, let's take a short break. Coffee and refreshments are in the back if anyone needs a moment." His voice quivered with the kind of discomfort only people who witness family implosions can understand. Chairs scraped. People stood slowly, some unsure where to look, others pretending they didn't feel the heaviness thickening the air. Conversations began in hushed fragments and aborted sentences. My mother hadn't moved. She sat at the edge of her chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes shone with tears she wasn't letting fall, not yet. She watched me with a mixture of sorrow and pride so deep it almost undid me. Across the room, my father gripped the back of his chair, knuckles white, staring downward as if the tablecloth might reveal an escape route. No one approached him. Even the relatives who always defended him stayed back, their expressions pinched with discomfort. My sister appeared beside me, her face flushed. "Everyone in there is awake now," she whispered. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "Is it bad?" She grimaced. "Some want to hug you. Some want to hide. And Dad looks like his whole world just tilted." She wasn't wrong. Something in him had cracked open, but instead of letting the light in, he looked terrified of what might leak out. Mama stood finally and walked toward me. Her steps were slow but certain. When she reached me, she placed her hands on both sides of my face and just held me there, eyes shining. "You did right," she whispered. Did I? My voice trembled not from regret, but from the weight of everything spilling loose. Mama nodded. "You said what needed saying, and you said it with truth, not spite." I rested my forehead against hers. "Are you angry with me?" "No," she said, and her voice cracked. "I'm relieved. Someone finally said the words I never had the strength to. That sentence almost broke me more than anything my father had done." "I need some air," I murmured. Mama nodded, stepping aside so Evan could walk with me. He slid his hand into mine, and together we slipped out the side door into the cool, late afternoon air. Outside, the world went on. Cars passed on the road. A lawnmower buzzed faintly in the distance. Birds chirped in a nearby tree, oblivious to the emotional wreckage unfolding inside the hall. I leaned back against the brick wall, letting the air cool the heat in my face. Evan stood beside me, shoulder brushing mine. "Are you angry I spoke up today?" I asked quietly. He looked at me with a tenderness so deep it made my chest ache. "No, I'm proud of you. And I'm honored you spoke for me. But more than that, you spoke for yourself." I swallowed hard. I've never done that before, Not like this." "It showed," he said softly. "Your voice didn't shake, even when your hands did." I exhaled a shaky half-laugh. "You noticed I notice everything about you," he said, "especially when you're brave." Before I could answer, the door swung open and my sister stepped out. She closed it behind her, rubbing her arms against the breeze. "Well," she said dryly, "if anyone was sleepy in there, they're awake now." A startled laugh escaped me, sudden and unsteady. "Is it really that bad? Bad, no," she said. "Intense, yes. Necessary, absolutely." She sighed. "Dad looks like someone pulled the earth out from under him." "Good," I muttered before I could stop myself. Hannah nodded. He needed to hear it, even if he'll never admit it. She leaned against the wall beside us. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," I said honestly. Evan squeezed my hand. We stood together for a while, letting the breeze wash away the last remnants of shock. Then, because weddings don't pause for emotional catastrophes, we went back inside. The rest of the reception felt like watching people walk around fragile glass. There were smiles, but they trembled. Laughter, but it fluttered awkwardly. Every conversation paused whenever Daddy appeared in someone's periphery. Some relatives hugged me tightly when he wasn't looking. "You were brave," they whispered. "You did the right thing." Others kept close to him, their expressions guarded. They weren't defending him so much as avoiding the discomfort of reevaluating someone they had admired for years. Humans cling to illusions because they're easier than truth, even when those illusions cut us. As the night wound down, people began saying their goodbyes. The DJ packed his equipment with the caution of someone handling explosives. Mama and Hannah cleaned up the tables in silence. Evan helped stack chairs. And Daddy, he disappeared. He didn't say goodbye, didn't acknowledge the ceremony, didn't congratulate us. He slipped out the side door like someone fleeing a crime scene and drove off while I was hugging a cousin from out of town. Sometimes the cruelest thing a parent can give you is their back. At first, I told myself good riddance, that I didn't need him, that the silence he left behind didn't matter. But silence does matter, especially when it comes from someone whose voice shaped your life, even if that voice caused harm. In the days after the wedding, I waited for the explosion. A phone call, a long text, a lecture, a tirade, some attempt to reclaim control. None came. The silence grew heavier. I returned to work. Evan and I settled into our little rental house with its mismatched furniture and squeaky floorboards. Life became ordinary again. We argued about which bookshelf to buy. We tried new recipes and burned half of them. We spent Sundays on the couch watching football. But beneath the simplicity, something gnawed at me. A small, persistent ache. My father's silence. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't healing. It was a void. A void filled with years of unresolved hurts and unspoken questions. A void shaped like the father I had always hoped to have, but didn't. Late at night, when Evan was asleep beside me, I would lie awake, imagining conversations with my father. Sometimes I yelled at him, telling him everything I'd held back. Sometimes I begged him to understand. Sometimes he apologized, and that dream was the cruelest of all. None of it happened. One Sunday afternoon, while folding laundry at the kitchen table, I realized I was exhausted. Not from confrontation, but from waiting for something that might never come. And in that moment, I understood something important. Silence isn't always power. Sometimes silence is just fear wearing armor. So I did something I never thought I would. I wrote my father a letter, a long one. A letter where I didn't yell, didn't justify, didn't accuse. A letter where I told him exactly how his words shaped me, how his temper scarred our family, how his pride suffocated every room, how his silence after the wedding hurt more than his insult on the microphone. I told him I wanted him in my life, but not at the cost of my dignity, not at the cost of my marriage, not at the cost of the woman I was becoming. When I finished, I read it aloud to Evan. He listened with his whole heart, then said, "Mail it, Marion. Whatever comes after, you'll know you did your part." So the next morning, I walked to the blue mailbox on the corner, slid the envelope into the slot, and heard the faint metallic thud as it landed inside. I stood there for a long time, waiting for something, a sign, a shift, a release. But the street stayed quiet. The world kept spinning. 3 weeks passed. No call, no text, no letter. And for the first time, the silence wasn't something done to me. It was the result of something I had done. The truth was finally out. Not just the truth I had said into a microphone, but the truth I had written with my own hand. And healing, real healing, never begins with someone else's apology. It begins when you stop apologizing for the truth. 3 months passed before my father showed up at my door. 3 long, uneven months where silence wrapped itself around my days like a shadow that wouldn't leave. I kept busy with work at the station, with unpacking our new place, with finding small routines that made my marriage feel like a home. Evan and I found our rhythm the way people do when they finally feel safe. But even in the comfort of those ordinary moments, a part of me listened for a phone call that never came. Some evenings I convinced myself I didn't care. I would look at the framed wedding photo on the mantel, the one taken before the microphone incident, and think he chose to miss this. He chose to lose this. Other nights the ache returned sharp and familiar, reminding me that love, even painful love, doesn't disappear just because you name the wounds. Then came that Saturday morning. The day started quietly with sunlight sliding across the floorboards, and Evan humming in the kitchen while frying eggs. I sat at our little table reading a report for work, the smell of coffee warming the room. It felt peaceful, normal. The kind of morning I used to dream about during deployments. And then someone knocked, not a quick tap, not the delivery driver's cheerful rhythm. It was heavier, hesitant, like whoever stood on the other side wasn't sure if they should be there. Evan looked at me from across the kitchen. Expecting anyone, I shook my head. The knock came again. I stood slowly, my heartbeat rising as I crossed the living room. Something in me already knew before I opened the door. My father stood on the porch. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, he still carried the same broad shoulders and weather-lined face, but something in his posture had changed. His windbreaker hung open, his hands shoved awkwardly into the pockets as if he didn't know what to do with them. His hair seemed grayer. Or maybe I had simply never seen him in honest light before. He didn't speak at first. Neither did I. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Can I come in?" His voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't booming. It was uncertain. The uncertainty felt foreign coming from him. I stepped aside, letting him enter. Evan appeared behind me, offering a polite nod. My father returned it stiffly, then looked around the living room as if stepping into another country. "We can sit," I said, motioning toward the couch. He nodded, lowering himself cautiously onto one end, while Evan and I took the chairs across from him. The space between us felt loaded heavy with everything unsaid. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Then he exhaled, rubbing his palms against his knees. "I got your letter." I folded my hands in my lap to keep them from shaking. "I know. I read it," he added. More than once. He didn't look at me as he said it. His gaze stayed fixed on the coffee table, as if afraid eye contact might pierce whatever courage he'd scraped together to come here. "I didn't come sooner," he continued, "because I didn't know what to say. And because I didn't want to show up just to defend myself. I've done enough of that in my life." My chest tightened. This wasn't the man who grabbed microphones for attention. This wasn't the man who barked orders or tore people down. This was someone stripped bare, someone facing himself for the first time in a long time. I didn't realize, he said slowly, how much I'd hurt you, or your mother, or him. He nodded slightly toward Evan. Evan sat still, respectful but present. My father swallowed. "I always told myself I was protecting you, guiding you, keeping you from mistakes." He paused. "But maybe the mistake was mine. Maybe I was scared. Scared you'd outgrow me. Scared you wouldn't need me. Scared that if you made your own choices, you'd see how small mine had been." The honesty in his voice was so raw it startled me. He finally looked up, and the moment his eyes met mine, I saw something I had never seen there before. Fear. Not of me, but fear of losing me. I tried to speak, but my throat caught. For years I had imagined apologizing to myself because he never would. Now here he was saying the words I never expected him to say. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Soft, broken, real. There are apologies that fall like leaves, light, insubstantial. And there are apologies that strike like stones, solid enough to change the ground beneath you. His landed with the weight of years. My vision blurred. Evan leaned forward slightly, giving me space but offering silent strength. My father continued, voice trembling. "I can't undo what happened at your wedding. Or the years before that. I can't rewrite who I was." He hesitated. "But I can try to be someone different now. If you let me." I took a slow breath. "Dad, I didn't write the letter to punish you. I wrote it because I was tired of silencing myself, tired of carrying the weight alone." He nodded. "I know that now. And I'm not asking for perfection," I said softly. "I never was. I just wanted respect." His mouth pressed into a tight line as if absorbing the word. Respect, a concept he had demanded but rarely given. "I want to try," he said. His voice cracked. "I want another chance." Evan spoke gently. "That means a lot." My father turned to him, and for the first time in all the months since they'd met, there was no condescension in his expression, no judgment, just a man acknowledging another man he had misjudged. "I was wrong about you," my father said. Evan nodded once. "We all learn different ways to be strong." Something softened in my father's face. His shoulders loosened. His breath steadied. We talked for a long time. Not about everything. We weren't ready for everything. But he asked about my work. He asked how I liked the neighborhood. He asked whether the old truck Evan was fixing still gave trouble. There were pauses, awkward at times, but they weren't the brittle silences we used to navigate. They were spaces where newness could breathe. Eventually he stood to leave. He reached the door, then stopped, turning back toward me with a vulnerability I didn't know he was capable of. "I can't promise I'll get this right," he said. "I've been myself a long time. But I'm trying." I rose and stepped closer. "Trying is enough, and we'll take it one day at a time." He nodded, eyes shining. "You deserve better than what I gave you." For the first time, I didn't shrink when he stepped forward. He pulled me into a hug, hesitant, unfamiliar, but real. His arms felt heavy with regret, with hope, with years lost and years still possible. When he stepped back, he looked at Evan. "Take care of her," he said softly. Evan didn't answer with bravado or defensiveness. Just a simple "I will." My father walked down the driveway toward his truck. The late morning light cast long shadows behind him, shadows that stretched but didn't swallow him like before. He paused once, glancing back at the house. At us. Then he got in and drove away. When the sound of his engine faded, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Evan stepped behind me, sliding his arms around my waist. "How do you feel?" I leaned back against him, like something old just cracked open, and something new might grow from it. He kissed the top of my head. He came. "That's the first step." "I know," I whispered. But healing is not a single moment. It's a path. And he had just taken his first shaky step onto it. Later that evening, Mama called. "I heard he visited," she said softly. "He did." And I hesitated. He apologized. Silence on the other end. Then a breath that sounded like relief wrapped in disbelief. Maybe Mama whispered, "This will be the year things change." Maybe. The word felt fragile but warm. As I hung up, I realized something important. The wedding confrontation wasn't the end of our family story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where truth wasn't buried, where respect wasn't optional, where silence no longer protected the wrong person. Healing wouldn't erase the past. But it could change the future. Healing doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It doesn't arrive all at once, wrapped neatly in forgiveness and smiles. It comes quietly, tentatively, in small moments that would be easy to miss if you weren't watching for them. And after my father left our house that morning, Those small moments began to appear like fragile sparks in the dark. The first came 2 weeks later when Mama called to tell me he had fixed the broken step on their porch. Not with the familiar grumbling or the loud complaints he usually gave whenever the house needed work. He did it without being asked, without announcing it, without expecting praise. He didn't even tell me he was out there, Mama said. I found him kneeling on the boards, humming to himself. The image stunned me. Not because he repaired something he had always been good with his hands, but because he repaired it quietly. My father was a man who performed everything. Every chore was a monologue, every fix an opportunity for praise. But this small, silent act felt like something new. The second moment came when Hannah told me he had apologized to her for snapping during a phone conversation. A real apology. The kind that names the wrongdoing and doesn't add excuses. He said he was wrong, she whispered over the phone as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. I think he meant it. I sat on the couch for several minutes after hanging up, absorbing the shock. My father didn't apologize. It simply wasn't something he knew how to do. Yet here he was practicing a new language late in life. The third moment happened unexpectedly at the grocery store. I had stopped by after work, still in uniform, grabbing vegetables for dinner. As I turned into the cereal aisle, I saw him, my father staring intently at a box of granola bars like it held ancient wisdom. He looked up and froze, not in anger, not in defensiveness, in uncertainty. I broke the silence first. "Hey, Dad." "Hey," he echoed, voice softer than usual. We stood there for a moment, surrounded by breakfast food and fluorescent lights. It felt surreal. "How have you been?" he asked. "Busy," I said. "Working a lot." He nodded like he understood that was safer territory. Then he hesitated, shifting his weight. "Your mother, she's been making that chicken pot pie you like." He paused. "You and Evan should come by sometime. If you want." If you want. The words lodged themselves in my heart. My father had never offered anything conditionally. He had always expected obedience, not choice. "We will," I said. "Let's set a date." His shoulders eased ever so slightly, like he'd been bracing for rejection. We parted ways with an awkward but genuine goodbye. As I walked to my car, the late afternoon sunlight warmed my face, and for the first time, hope didn't feel dangerous. The biggest shift came when we finally visited for dinner. Mama opened the door with the same warm embrace she'd always given, but something in her seemed lighter, less braced, less afraid of the storm she had weathered for decades. The kitchen smelled like butter and rosemary, and the table was set with her good dishes, the ones she used to only bring out on holidays. My father sat at the far end of the table. His posture was straighter, his shirt tucked in his hair combed. But the biggest difference wasn't physical. It was in the way he looked at us when we walked through the door. Not with pride, not with scrutiny, with effort. "Hi," he said, clearing his throat. "Come on in." Evan greeted him with a handshake. My father returned it firmly, but without that familiar need to dominate the gesture. It was simply a greeting, nothing more. During dinner, he asked Evan about his job, not the loaded questions he used to ask, but genuine curiosity. "You're working on that bridge project off Highway 32, he asked. Evan nodded. "Yeah, we're expanding the supports. Storm season a few years back weakened the structure." My father's brows lifted in interest. I remember that. Those floods nearly washed out the whole west side. "It's been a challenge," Evan said. "But we've made progress." My father nodded again. "Sounds important." He said it like he meant it. And Evan smiled, small but sincere. Mama brought out dessert and my father complimented it, telling her it tasted just like the one her grandmother used to make. He hadn't said something warm like that in years. After dinner, he surprised me again. "Want to walk outside a minute?" he asked. We stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking softly under our feet. The sky was fading into dusk, streaked with orange and soft pink. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "You were right," he said quietly. My breath caught. "About what? About me?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "About how I talk. How I lead with anger. How I hurt people thinking I was helping. He glanced at me. That wasn't strength. That was fear. Hearing him say it out loud felt like watching a mountain shift. I didn't want you to marry anyone, he admitted. Not because of Evan, because I didn't want to lose my place. I didn't know how to be your father unless you needed me. I swallowed the ache rising in my chest. You didn't lose me, I whispered. He looked out toward the trees lining the backyard. I know that now. He paused, voice thickening. I'm sorry I didn't know it sooner. The apology didn't erase the hurt, but it softened something inside me that had been rigid for years. When Evan and I drove home that night, I stared out the window watching the streetlights flicker across the windshield. My heart felt both heavy and light, a strange combination I didn't know how to hold. Evan reached for my hand. How are you feeling? Like this is the start of something new, I said. Not perfect, but new. Over the next month, the small moments continued. My father helped Mama reorganize the garage without complaining. He started going for walks in the morning. He signed up for an anger management workshop at the community center. He called Hannah just to ask how she was, not to correct her, not to question her decisions, but to listen. He didn't talk about the wedding. Not once, not directly. But sometimes he'd look at me with a long, contemplative expression, as if replaying the moment when I took the microphone and turned our lives upside down. One afternoon he stopped by our house unannounced, not to criticize the yard, not to offer unwanted advice. He brought a toolbox and said, "Thought I'd take a look at that loose railing on your porch." I blinked. "Dad, you don't have to." "I know," he said. "That's why I want to." He fixed the railing in under 15 minutes, humming softly under his breath. When he finished, he dusted off his hands and said, "There, should hold up just fine now." "Thank you," I said. He shrugged. "Small things. But I'm learning they matter." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so I just hugged him. A real hug. The kind that didn't feel one-sided or stiff or forced. He hugged me back immediately. After he left, Evan stepped onto the porch, leaning beside me. "He's trying," Evan said. "He is," I whispered. "It's not an easy road," Evan added, "for him or for you." I nodded. "But we're on it. We didn't talk about what the future would look like. We didn't define forgiveness or outline expectations. We just stood there in the evening quiet, the world around us softening as the sun dipped below the horizon. Healing, I realized, isn't a destination. It's a practice. One my family was learning together, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. And for the first time in my life, that felt enough. The months that followed weren't dramatic. They didn't unfold in grand gestures or sweeping apologies. They were quieter, steadier, built from small shifts that felt almost invisible unless you knew what the past had looked like. Healing, I learned, rarely announces itself. It moves softly like sunlight stretching across a room at dawn, changing everything without demanding attention. By late summer, my father had settled into a rhythm that looked nothing like the man I had grown up with. It wasn't that he had become someone entirely different. He still walked with the same heavy stride. He still furrowed his brows when concentrating. He still spoke like a man who believed words carried weight. But the sharp edges had softened. The explosions had quieted. The pride that used to sit on his shoulders like armor had begun to crack in places where light now seeped through. I noticed it in the way he called Mama before she had to call him. In the way he sat with Hannah at the kitchen table listening instead of lecturing. In the way he looked at Evan with something closer to respect than suspicion. And I noticed it in myself too. The tension in my shoulders that had lived there for years slowly loosened. The instinct to brace for impact faded. The expectation of conflict dulled into something gentler. I had spent my entire childhood navigating his storms. Now I didn't feel weathered. I felt grounded. Our home, mine and Evan's, became a place I could breathe fully. The porch railing my father had fixed held firm. Evan worked late some nights, but always came home to wrap his arms around me like I was the one piece of his day that made the rest make sense. Mama visited often, her smile free of the stiffness it used to carry. Even Hannah stayed longer when she dropped by, marveling out loud that our tiny rental felt warmer than any place we'd lived growing up. One Sunday afternoon, my father asked if we'd like to come over for dinner. It wasn't a request layered in expectation or duty. It was simple, gentle. A question, not a demand. Even that felt like a victory. We arrived just before sunset. The house looked the same from the outside, but I felt different walking up the porch steps, lighter somehow. When the door opened, the scent of roasted chicken and rosemary drifted out, wrapping around us like a welcome. Mama greeted us with a hug that lingered. She looked younger than she had in years. The lines at the corners of her eyes seemed less burdened. My father stood behind her, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel. He gave a small nod to Evan and an even smaller smile to me. The dinner was quiet but warm. My father complimented the seasoning on the chicken, which made Mama flush with unexpected pride. He asked Evan about the new bridge supports near the marshland and truly listened to the explanation. Hannah teased him, and instead of snapping or correcting her, he smirked and shook his head. It was such an ordinary evening, and yet it felt extraordinary in its softness. After dinner, Mama brought out slices of peach pie. It was still warm, the crust golden, the filling bubbling at the edges. I watched my father take a bite, close his eyes briefly and sigh like a man remembering something he'd forgotten how to enjoy. When I finished eating, he cleared his throat. "You want to go for a walk?" he asked. The words landed gently, but their meaning was enormous. My father had never asked for quiet moments with me, only moments where I was expected to listen, agree, obey. This felt different. This felt intentional. We stepped outside into the stitching twilight. Crickets hummed. Fireflies blinked near the tree line. The air was warm but carried a soft breeze that lifted the hair at my temples. For a while we walked in silence. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of our old life, but a peaceful quiet where nothing was expected except presence. Then he stopped near the old oak tree where Hannah and I used to play as children. He placed a hand on the rough bark, tracing a groove with his thumb. "I've been thinking a lot," he said. I waited. "You said something that day," he continued slowly. "At the wedding. Something that stayed with me." My heart tightened. "What was that?" "You said respect." He paused. "You said that's what you needed." I nodded. "Yes." He exhaled. "I didn't know how to give that. Not to you girls, not to your mother, not even to myself." His voice softened. I thought control was strength. I thought admitting fault made me weak. I thought if I kept you all in line, I'd never lose you. "You didn't lose me," I whispered. He looked away, his jaw tightening. I almost did. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The cicadas hummed like they were filling the silence with their own form of comfort. "I'm trying," he said finally. "I know I've got a lot to learn, a lot to fix." He looked at me then, and there was no pride in his eyes, only truth. "But I want to earn back what I broke, even if it takes the rest of my life." Emotion welled in my chest, rising and falling like a tide. I stepped closer and rested my hand over his. "Trying counts," I said. "And so does choosing something better." He nodded, a whispered tremor in his breath. When we returned to the porch, Mama and Evan were laughing quietly at something Hannah had said. My father paused for a moment, watching them, studying the scene like a man viewing his family through a new lens. "You picked a good man," he said softly to me. The words caught me so off guard that tears pricked my eyes. "I know," I whispered. "Better than I realized," he added. We stood there for a long moment, not as opponents, not as strangers navigating old wounds, but as a father and daughter learning how to rebuild something fragile but real. When Evan and I got home that night, we sat on the porch steps, letting the quiet of our street wrap around us. The moon hung low. The world felt gentle. Evan brushed my hair back. "You did something powerful, you know." "I didn't do it alone," I said. He smiled. "No, you did it brave." I leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his shoulder and the steadiness of his breath. For the first time in years, the ache inside me felt replaced by something softer, something hopeful. Healing isn't perfect. My father still had moments where old habits crept in, where frustration tensed his jaw or impatience tightened his tone. But he corrected himself faster now. He listened more. He apologized without being pressed. And each small effort added to something larger, a foundation built on respect rather than fear. And I found that I no longer walked through life waiting for impact. I no longer shrank when someone raised their voice. I no longer mistook silence for peace. I had found my voice, and in doing so I had given my father a chance to find his humanity. Families don't transform overnight. They bend, they stumble, they break and rebuild. They learn and unlearn. And sometimes, if one person chooses courage, the whole story changes. If you're listening to this, and you've seen pieces of your own life in mine, if you've ever struggled with finding your voice, or standing up for your worth, or breaking a cycle that felt older than you are, I hope you remember this: silence protects the person who causes the harm. Truth protects the person who endures it. And healing begins when someone decides the story won't end with pain. Thank you for sitting with me in this story. If it touched something in your heart, I would love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments, let me know where you're listening from. And if you'd like to hear more stories of family courage and second chances, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Your support helps bring these stories to life. And until next time, take care of your voice. It's stronger than you think.